Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the final Fountainhead discussion group, coming to you live from the Ayn Rand Institute. My name is Ben Baer. I'm a fellow and instructor at ARI. And before we begin our discussion today, I do want to just make a few quick announcements and reminders. So first of all, if you are watching us today on Facebook or on YouTube or Periscope or other social media channels, that's a fine thing to do. But you can also participate with us more directly if you join us through Zoom. You can register pretty quickly to do that by going to the website that I've just displayed above my head, courses.aynrand.org/webinars/Fountainhead. And there you will be able to post questions that we will get directly and also participate in chat with us. Want to also remind everybody that one of the big reasons we're running this discussion group is because the Ayn Rand Institute sponsors the world's largest essay contest, the Fountainhead contest. Anthem, there's a contest for Anthem, also for Atlas Shrugged. But the most proximate reason, of course, is the Fountainhead contest. And this year we extended the deadline for submissions until May 28th. So if you go to the address I've listed above again, you'll see where you can submit. You'll see what the questions and the topics are. And you'll notice that there is a wide array of prize money that's available. So that deadline is just a week away. After our discussion today, that'll give you still a week, if you're a student, to maybe put the final touches on your essay. We're wishing the best for all of you out there and hoping to hear more about what difference this discussion section might have made for your essay. I'll also mention that you should, if you're interested in finding out more about Ayn Rand's ideas, more about her novels, more about her philosophy, there's an app that you can download on the Apple Store and also on the Google Play Store. The Ayn Rand University app, it's got hundreds of hours of free content with lectures and courses about Ayn Rand's books and philosophy. And I'm going to have a few other announcements to close us out with at the end of our session today, but I thought I would at least start with that first list. And I'll just make one quick note about how we're going to proceed today. So today is a special episode because it's our final episode. We skipped last week because we had an objectivist conference over the weekend. So we're having 2 hours devoted to this material this week. The first hour is going to be discussing the very first the very last reading from the book. We're looking at part 4, chapters 11 through 20. We're going to be talking about some of the discussion questions that we posted to the Facebook group about this. But then in the second and final hour, we're just going to throw it open to Q&A from you, the audience. We've already gotten a number of questions that people submitted in advance, which we may have some time to comment on, but we're probably going to throw things over to those of you who are attending live first and see what you want to ask about. And we'll probably look at a mix of those questions. So without much further ado, let me now ask my colleague at ARI, Keith Lockitch, to join me. Keith, you out there?
Hi, Ben. Hi, everybody.
Hey. So, Keith, this is it's been I think a great experience rereading this book, at least for me. I don't know how many times I've read it now. This has been, I mean, it's at least 10, possibly more. And I've learned all kinds of new things about it this time, even still.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have an excuse to reread it again because we're doing something for ARI. I always find new insights, new passages that didn't strike me before, new insights into the characters and themes. So yeah, it's been fun.
Very much agreed. So not only is it the climax of our discussion, but of course, this reading brings us to the climax of the drama in the book. So I'll start just with a quick recap of the major events of the last 100 pages or so that we asked people to read. Of course, it begins with Rourke and Wynand on a cruise, beginning to discuss some of the philosophical issues that Rourke has been reflecting on. At the very beginning of the book, he talked about wanting to find out about the principle behind the dean. He shares with Wynand that he has identified it, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later today. Once they get back from their trip, Rourke discovers that Keating has not been able to stop his designs from Cortlandt homes from being altered and made a lot worse. As a result, Rourke makes a decision. He goes to Dominique. He asks her to help him with a plot. She's going to lure out the one night watchman who's watching the site. He then dynamites the building. She makes herself look like a bystander. Rourke offers himself up for arrest. And at this point, Wynand begins to mount a campaign for his defense. But he faces a lot of opposition. His paper, many of the people on his staff revolt against him. He fires key editors, including Toohey and other columnists. Most of his staff quits. At a certain point, the board of directors then offers him an ultimatum. They basically say, you either stop the campaign for Rourke or you close the banner. This is too much for Wynand. He gives in and he turns on Rourke. This means that Dominique now leaves Wynand. She goes to be with Rourke, and in a curious turn of events, allows her relationship to be known to the world, very different from her previous outlook on things. We'll talk more about that later too. Rourke is tried for the bombing and acquitted. We could talk about why exactly. But at this point, Wynand shuts down the banner, so Toohey cannot return to his job. And even though he's estranged from Rourke at this point, he still offers Rourke the commission for building the tallest building in the world, the Wynand building. And at the very end, we see Dominique rising to meet Rourke at the top of the construction site, and the curtain closes. So there's a lot to talk about here, and we only have an hour to do it, and probably we won't get through everything we need to, but we should still try to make a good go at it. And so we asked 4 questions. We posted 4 questions to the Facebook group earlier. I'm going to deal with them a little bit out of order, starting with the 3rd question that I posted about some of the themes that come out in Rourke's courtroom speech. And this is a place, of course, where we get a summation of the meaning of the book in the author's eyes and an overview of much of her philosophy through the mouth of Rourke. In this speech, Rourke says that the basic issue facing mankind in the culture at the time he's speaking is the choice of independence or dependence. It's what he calls the code of the creator versus the code of the second-hander. And I thought it would be good, now that we see that this is what the authors in Rourke's view of the fundamental stakes in the story are, we should take a moment, look back on each of the major characters in the book to see how they themselves faced this alternative and how they, which side of it they came down on. And I'll say one more thing to give us a bit of an overview for this discussion at the top, which is that while you see a lot of Rourke's philosophy coming out in the courtroom speech, you also see it coming out in that conversation that he has with Wynand on the yacht, and even before the courtroom speech happens. And I'll read one passage because I think it sums up a number of different things that we've been discussing over the course of these 7 weeks. We've asked a lot of questions about what does it mean to be selfish? What does it mean to be selfless? Does the author think this is good? Does she think it's bad? And Rourke sums it up in one paragraph. In his view, and presumably in hers, our greatest moments are personal, self-motivated, not to be touched. This is, by the way, on page 607. The things which are sacred or precious to us are the things we withdraw from promiscuous sharing. But now we are taught to throw everything within us into public light and common pawing, to seek joy in meeting halls. We haven't even got a word for the quality I mean, for the self-sufficiency of man's spirit. It's difficult to call it selfishness or egoism. The words have been perverted. They've come to mean Peter Keating. But Gail, I think the only cardinal evil on earth is that of placing your prime concern with other men. I've always demanded a certain quality in people I've liked. I've always recognized it at once, and it's the only quality I respect in men. I chose my friends by that standard. Now I know what it is, a self-sufficient ego. Nothing else matters. And then we see Wynand repeating many of these ideas that there's something evil about being selfless. There's something good about being having a self-sufficient ego in a way that we'll see that Rourke does. So let's talk about the characters. Actually, let me back up just one moment with one last bit of background before we look at the characters. So when we actually look at Rourke's speech, he also tells us more about what this choice means, about what this choice to be independent, to have a self-sufficient ego actually means, as opposed to the alternative of being selfless or being a second-hander. And the most fundamental point for him is that to be independent means to hold your perception of the truth above all things. This is what helps us understand what he means when he talks about the self and about having reverence for one's self, if you want to call that selfish. The self is the spirit. It's the thing that thinks, feels, judges, acts. It focuses its mind on reality for the purpose of the task of living. And so if you want to use the word selfish, and Rand herself does in other writings, in this sense, Rourke is supremely selfish. He wants to do his work his way to improve the world in the way that he sees fit. That's as opposed to the selfless second-handers who live through the convictions, the beliefs, the values of others. And that's what Rourke means then ultimately by the principle behind the Dean. That's what he thinks motivates the Dean and many others. So which others?
Can I just, before we get to the others, can I just jump in that? So one of the major things that Ayn Rand is doing in the Fountainhead is challenging our conventional conception of selfishness. We think of the selfish person as somebody who's out for their own interest, but at the expense of others, by means of preying on or exploiting others. And she's challenging this conception and presenting a vision of what it looks like to be truly selfish. And what she means by that is selfish in the independent sense that Rourke is talking about in his speech. And she, as we turn to this other characters, part of what she's doing with some of the other characters is showing what it looks like when you have a character that embodies our sort of conventional understanding of selfishness. And she shows that at a fundamental level, that those characters are not actually selfish. They don't actually act in a way that achieves their long-range rational self-interest. So, yeah. So let's. So part of what she's doing in the novel, I think we've said this a few times throughout, is she's showing Rourke, the consummate first-hander, in contrast to a number of variations on the theme of second-handedness. I think it's worth mentioning that her working title for the book was Second-Hand Lives. So the idea was that she's got Rourke, her hero, who represents first-handedness and egoism in the rational sense, in her new conception of that term, set off against a whole bunch of variations on the theme of second-handedness. And so the different characters that we're going to talk about, they all represent different forms of second-handedness. Now, I just think it's worth mentioning that she changed the title ultimately, but when it was pointed out to her that by calling it Second-Hand Lives, she puts the emphasis and the focus on all the characters that she doesn't like, rather than on Howard Rourke where it belongs. And so she changed the title, to reflect the idea that independence is the fountainhead of human progress and so on. So, so in what way are the other characters variations on the theme of second-handedness? So go ahead, Ben, you're going to start by talking.
Well, for one thing, I'd like to let people in the chat say a little bit more about this.
Oh, right.
Who would you say, before I start to say anything about it, who would you say are the clearest examples of the second-handers in this story? I think there's clear examples and there's less clear examples, but let's start with the clearest ones. And Charlotte already in the chat chimes in with Keating, as she says he sees himself as a reflection of the praise of others, as empty without others, depends entirely on perceptions of others. Gretchen also says Keating is the clearest. Ellen and Cal then add Toohey. I agree with those first two votes. Now, someone named Hero is asking a question more like, is Dominique a second-hander? That's a good question. I think that's something we should come back to. There's clearly something off with Dominique at the beginning, right? And she goes through a process of development. And we're going to save our discussion of Dominique till the very end today, because there's a lot to say about her, and we asked a whole separate question about it. Sonali also says Toohey's followers. Ashwin says he thinks maybe Wynand is a second-hander because he seeks to control others. Wynand is also a less clear case, but someone we should spend some time thinking about, because this is something that has clear cases and less than clear cases. Let's talk about Keating and Tui first. As Rourke himself mentioned in that passage I read, most people look at someone like Keating and they regard him as the selfish person, the person who's out for his own good. And Keating himself, at least on certain occasions, thinks the same thing. But of course, in the passage that I just read, he talks about how Keating really has no self at all of his own. He lives through the goals, the motives, convictions of others. If what the self is your mind and your values, then he's never bothered to form one of his own. And Rourke also talks about how, especially in Keating's case, it's precisely this lack of self, it's precisely this selflessness, which is at the root of many of Keating's obvious vices, because he's so reliant on others' admiration and even on others' foolishness of not realizing what kinds of things he's doing. That helps him fake a kind of self-respect. It helps him think he's better than he actually is. There's lots of examples of this. There's the fact that he's not doing his own work. There's the fact that he cheats and copies other people's work, but hey, other people like it. There's the fact that he even kills Lucius Hire, but nobody finds out. All that matters for him is what others are aware of, and whether the fact that they like him. It's very notable that he gives money away after he gets the commission for the Cosmo-Slotnick building, feeling guilty about having had Rourke do the designing for him. But hey, he's given away the money to Ellsworth Toohey, so he's a good person because of that. And Toohey is...
Before we go to Toohey again, I think it's worth, when we talked about part one, and the part one really shows the parallel careers of Rourke and Keating, and we really put a stress on the question of which of these characters is intended to be portrayed as a selfish person. And what we talked about at the time is, according to the conventional perspective on selfishness, Keating embodies selfishness in that sense. He's willing to, manipulate people and trample on his co-workers in order to get ahead. He goads Lucius Hire into his story. All the things that Ben just described are ways in which he seems to embody our conventional understanding of selfishness. And part of what Rand is doing by showing the arc of his character, and by showing that the essence of his character really is that he has no independent values. He has no firsthand goals and ambitions. It's all comes from other people. And the most important scene is the one that we already talked about previously, where he's having this discussion with Dominique, and he says that, "Where's your I?" And she says, "Where's yours, Peter?" We see that he fundamentally has no I. He has no self in this fundamental way. And this is Rand's way of showing how empty and incorrect our conventional understanding of the concept of selfishness is. And through her portrayal of Howard Rourke and the arc of his character, we get a clear portrait of what her new conception of egoism is and what it looks like to be truly selfish. I keep beating that drum because I think it's worth stressing.
And Keating rallies for a brief span of time, especially in the last reading that we did. He tries to make up for some of the bad things that he's done. He tries to think for himself, but we see in this last set of readings that he's so far gone. that he really didn't have much in reserves to rally with. And so we see him in front of Ellsworth Toohey, and he's really basically cowering before Toohey now. I mean, he's just accepting everything that Toohey says and picking at his hangnails and just listening for what's the next thing Toohey wants him to do. He goes into the courtroom, he testifies against Rourke, and the people in the audience, when he leaves, feel as though it's as if no person has actually left the room, because he's just an empty shell of a person at this point. I see a number of other people in the chat who are commenting on a variety of other minor characters who are themselves like Keating in lots of different ways. His mother, various people like Hopton Stoddard. Yeah, I mean, the cast of the book is loaded with people like this, all kinds of Keating types. I mean, I think in part that's because the author thinks that there are a lot of people like Keating in real life.
And that to be like Howard Roark is a real achievement.
Yeah.
To be selfish in that rational sense is not something that everybody just naturally is. It's an achievement.
Right. And it's one of the reasons why she rejects the idea that everybody is selfish. That's something we could talk a lot more about. But then there's Toohey. And Toohey is not the sort of person that you meet every day, but he is a really exaggerated version of the same thing that Keating is, and that's by his own admission. In a very revealing passage, I think, pages 638, 639, Toohey says, "I have less independence than you, whom I just forced to sell your soul. You've used people at least for the sake of what you could get from them for yourself. I want nothing for myself. I use people for the sake of what I can do to them. It's my only function and satisfaction. I have no private purpose. I want power. I want my world of the future." And here I think it's useful to compare what Toohey's motivation is to someone like Wynand. We'll talk more about Wynand's pursuit of power shortly, especially in connection with one of the other questions. Wynand was also out for power. But Toohey and Wynand have very different things they want to do with that power. For Wynand, at least, the way that he even tells it to himself, at least, is that he's out for power for the sake of things that he himself wants. He wants to use his power to get money, to be able to stock his gallery, to be able to build houses for Dominique, and at the end of the story, he thinks he'll be able to use it to defend Rourke. And he's always given himself that, at least that rationalization for why he wants power. But Toohey has no such illusions. Toohey is basically, from what we can tell and from what he says, it looks like he's after power just for its own sake, for no further purpose. Power for the sake of power. And when you think about what that really actually means, power, and I know, Keith, you wanted to say more about this later, but just to exercise power to no constructive purpose means exercising it to a destructive purpose. And it means that he wants power over things you can destroy, things that do produce and construct things of value. And that's why Rourke becomes such a focus for him, because he wants to take down Rourke. He explicitly admits he wants not even just to kill Rourke, but to make him take orders, to put him in jail so that he can experience what it's like to just order Rourke around. This is why he was so impressed with what Keating was able to do by getting Rourke to build all these buildings for him, including especially Cortlandt Home, because that's symbolic to Toohey of giving Rourke orders.
Yeah, so Toohey's speech to Keating is interesting because he tells us a major part of what his motivations are. He's super explicit about it in a way that, you know, is almost it's almost slightly unrealistic that he could be that self-aware of his views. and that this is actually his goal. But what I think is also interesting is what he doesn't talk about or what he doesn't admit, but what we learn about him way back in part 2 when we get his life story. And I think that also, so there's the parts of his motivation that he tells us explicitly, but then there are parts of his motivation which it's unclear whether he would even be willing to admit them to himself. But I think now that we're at the end of the story and we can look back, I think it's worth raising some of those things. Toohey is somebody, one of the things that's notable in the description of his childhood is a fundamental lack of values. There isn't anything, he doesn't have any creative ambitions. He doesn't have any values that he wants to pursue. He doesn't have any goals in the way that Rourke has always wanted to be an architect. Toohey doesn't have any dreams or ambitions or values or goals like that. We see this in little touches, when his mother is saying, I want a bicycle for Ellsworth. Horace, I want a bicycle for Ellsworth. And we find out that Toohey doesn't want a bicycle. And what he wants to do instead is use this conversation as a way of, undermining his father by saying, his father always wanted to own a business. He doesn't own a business, but Willie Lovett's father owns a dry goods store and he can afford it. I don't want to be like Willie Lovett, the snobs like that who have bicycles. I don't need a bicycle. And the narration says it's true that he didn't want a bicycle. He doesn't want a bicycle. He doesn't want a new suit. He doesn't want all these things that his mother wants for him. What he wants to do is express his sort of hatred and resentment for those who have ability, who have creative ingenuity, and who have values that they cherish. This isn't something that he admits when he's talking to Keating and saying what his motives are, but fundamentally, this is what's driving him: is this is what drives his desire to have power and ultimately to rule and to destroy those kind of people, the independent people.
And Sally in the chat asks a question about, well, why does he want this power? Couldn't it just be a way of surviving in the world rather than depending on other people? Rather than surviving independently, he survives and thrives depending on the ignorance and weakness of other people. And certainly, there are probably people like that, but at least if you go by what Toohey says, it's what he's after is something more crude and less strategic than that. If you go back, for instance, to the passage that you've remarked on a lot, Keith, the one on page 281, where he's looking out at the skyline and saying, it's such a sublime achievement. There's two different ways you could think of it. You could think of the people who made these buildings as our great benefactors, or you could say that the splendor of their achievement, which we can neither equal nor keep, has shown us what we are, that we don't want these free gifts of their grandeur. The cave by an oozing swamp and a fire of sticks rubbed together are preferable to skyscrapers and neon lights. Well, that's not the attitude of somebody who really is just scheming an easier way to get, say, material goods. He would rather give them up for the sake of being able to beat down his betters. And you see him saying other things like that later in the book, especially when you see conversations, say, between him and Gus Webb. He views Gus Webb as the man of the future, the man who's the thug, basically. He doesnn't care that Gus Webb is not going to be able to produce exquisite innovations in the way that Rourke does. And it's an interesting question. Are people really like this? Do people really just want destruction for its own sake? I think they do, but it's certainly something that's not obvious to everybody. Something that Ayn Rand wrote a lot about in other nonfiction works.
Well, and I think it's really the question of what is the essence of evil. And if you think about some of the evil people in history and you think about what kinds of things could be motivating them, what explains like an Adolf Hitler or somebody like that? I mean, you start to think that these kinds of motivations have to be operative in those real actual people. I think before we get to Wynand, I think it's worth pausing and maybe, because we're already getting some questions in the Q&A module. Charlotte asks if there are two definitions of selfishness that Ayn Rand uses. One, having an identity separate from others, 2, abusing others in order to gain wealth, fame, wealth, etc. for himself. Are there other terms we could use that might more clearly distinguish these two different yet related concepts? So part of Ayn Rand's perspective on the concept of selfishness is that it's not that there are two definitions and they both have equal validity. Part of her perspective is that the way the term is conventionally understood and even conventionally defined is actually incorrect. It represents what she calls a package deal. So it puts together elements that don't belong together. The idea of being concerned with one's own interests, with putting that together with the idea that what it means to be concerned with one's own interests is to get ahead by trampling on other people and preying on people and exploiting people, that is inherent in the concept of selfishness. So part of what one of the things that Ayn Rand spent a lot of time thinking about is how we use concepts and how the concepts that we use impact our ability to think about things clearly. And so what she's arguing is that it's not that the conventional way we understand the concept of selfishness is actually incorrect. And we've got to stop using it in that way and achieve a clearer, more precise understanding. So she has a collection of essays on morality called The Virtue of Selfishness. And the subtitle is A New Concept of Egoism. So what she's trying to put forward is a new concept of selfishness that more accurately reflects reality. And she's saying we should get rid of the old definition because it's wrong.
Okay, let's say a word or two about Wynand then, because so is he an independent creator, or is he a second-hander? Well, one thing that we know is that he and Rourke hit it off. We talked a fair amount about their relationship last time. And Rourke sees meeting Wynand as this encounter that cannot be repeated. And at one point he tells him, because you were not born to be a second-hander. So he sees that Wynand has this profound creative ability, that he is not in certain ways, he is not beholden to the standards and the values of other people. This is his art gallery here is a symbol of this, a totally set of private values that he doesn't want to share with anyone else. But not having been born to be a second-hander doesn't mean that he is determined to not be a second-hander for the rest of his life. And Wynand himself, in that same conversation with Rourke on the yacht about the principle behind the Dean and the nature of selflessness, admits to himself and to Rourke that if you take the idea of selflessness literally and seriously, that he's never really owned anything because he's given the world his soul in exchange for wealth. Now, as I discussed before, Wynand thinks that he can redeem this sacrifice of himself for the sake of power, which he can use to hold on to certain kinds of personal values. And this is why, for Wynand, love is about exception making. It's about compromising. You devote all your life to sacrificing your soul in one respect for the sake of this exceptional thing that you love. And that's also related to the fact that, of course, he's got great antipathy to integrity. And at the end of the conversation with Rourke, after they've spent some time analyzing what's wrong with second-handers like Keating and Tui, you see Rourke reflecting to himself, but not volunteering to Wynand, that he hasn't told him about his views of the worst kind of second-hander, the man who goes after power. And of course, Wynand thinks that his power is not second-handed. He thinks that his power is ultimately giving him some kind of control. But we're going to discuss very soon about where the flaws in this reasoning are. And this is part of the reason why earlier in our discussion, I mentioned it was, I think, probably not an accident that there's a scene between Elvis Garrett and Wynand about the gallant gallstone. Taken straight, the gallant gallstone is a critique of the idea of free will. And of course, it's very important for Rand that all of these characters do have free will. That's why Wynand wasn't born to be a second-hander. He wasn't born to be a first-hander either. But the other thing about the gallant gallstone is that he thinks he's independent, but that he's not. And that when someone takes a cough syrup or whatever, he gets flushed out of the system. And Wynand has free will to make the choices that he makes, but he spent so much of his life making choices in pursuit of power, which, as we'll see, end up making him beholden to the public, that he doesn't have the power that he thinks. And he ends up much like the position of the gallant gallstone. So I think part of that was dramatic irony on Rand's part in including that story.
Portland Homes, the castor oil, is that the idea?
Yeah, that's what it was, castor oil. Yeah. Well, but not just that. A lot of the other things that we're about to talk about, the ideas that he has accepted or at least helped to spread. So we also asked about Dominique and how she fits on the second-hand versus independent spectrum. But let's wait till we discuss the whole question that was just about her and how she changes over the course of the book and what she learns at the end to say more about that.
And Cal asked right at the beginning, what is the purpose of Dominique being placed at Cortland as a bystander? I think that also we can take that up when we get to the end, when we get to Dominique.
Yeah. So let's now talk about this, another question that we posted on a topic that we've spent some time already thinking about. What does this story portray about the relationship between morality and practicality, especially in the person of Rourke? How does this compare, contrast with Wynand? And Keith, I know you wanted to say something about Rourke first.
Yeah, so again, going back to part one of the book, we raised the question, if Keating in a certain way is being portrayed as selfish in the way we conventionally understand that term, is there a way in which Rourke is being portrayed as selfless, as a sort of selfless martyr to his artistic ideals? And one way you can frame the question is there a way in which Rourke's integrity is a liability? So he's clearly portrayed as a person with absolute integrity. He refuses to compromise on his designs. He refuses to compromise on his artistic vision in his buildings. They have to be built exactly as he designed them. He has to get the client's initials on them that say that they won't try to change them. But the question is, does his integrity make him a selfless martyr to his artistic ideals? And at the end of part one of the book, it certainly seemed like that was the case. Because of his refusal to compromise on his designs, he couldn't get clients. He couldn't get the commission for the Manhattan Bank building. He sort of was out on the street and he had to go break rocks in a granite quarry, in effect, to a convict laborer because of this, it's seemingly because of his refusal to compromise. But now that we see the full arc of his story, I think we can look at that question again and see Rand's final answer to this question. And what we see is her view that exactly the opposite is true. So ask yourself, how is it that Rourke ultimately comes to succeed in the end? And maybe we can throw this out as a question for people to put in the chat. What is the pattern of Rourke's success? How is it that he's ultimately able to, achieve a thriving business as an architect and find his clients and have, achieve the ability to continue to work as an architect? What do people think of that? Not really seeing people posting anything in the chat, so there we go. Okay, so Gretchen says, the people who recognize Rourke's talent find him. Okay, that's good. So how do they find? I mean, how is it that they're able to recognize it as Rourke's talent. So the point is that because of his refusal to compromise, so Merrill says his early life is an investment in his later life. So every building that because of his refusal to compromise, every building that he does build is a Rourke building. It has that Rourke quality. It's his best work that he's capable of at that point in his life. And so Gretchen says, people who understand and or respond to greatness will find those who are great. So what we're told about the pattern of Rourke's success is, so this is on page 509. It says he'd been very busy in the last 2 years. Monadnock Valley had not been his only commission. From different states, from unexpected parts of the country, calls had come for him. Privates, homes, small office buildings, modest shops. The story of every commission he received was the same. I was in New York and I liked the Enright House. I saw the Cord building. I saw a picture of the temple they tore down. So it's precisely because of his refusal to compromise on the integrity of his buildings that he's able to find clients who want what it is that he has to offer. If he were, let's just go back to the scene with the Manhattan Bank building. Let's say that he agreed to the changes that they wanted in the design. They put the Greek portico or whatever, the classic elements on his facade. Then the Manhattan Bank building that was constructed would not be a Rourke building. It wouldn't have the integrity of Rourke's design, and it wouldn't catch the eye of potential future clients who want what Rourke has to offer. So right from the very beginning in his conversation with the dean at Stanton, he says that he needs to, what he's looking for is his kind of clients. He's trying to find his kind of people who want what he has to offer. And the way he finds those people is precisely by means of his artistic integrity. So part of what Rand is conveying by showing the arc of Rourke's character is that his integrity, by sticking to this moral principle of integrity, that's actually the practical means of his success. And there's a way in which he understands this from the very beginning. When he refuses the Manhattan Bank building commission and the person says, why do you have to be so darn selfless about it? He says that was the most selfish thing you've ever seen a man do. So she's equating selfishness in her rational sense with being morally principled, having integrity, and with that being the practical means for success. And this is, don't have to say too much more about this now, but this is a broader idea in Rand's philosophy, the idea that moral principles are practical. There isn't a conflict between the moral and the practical, between doing what's right and doing what's practical. And so we see that in the arc of Rourke's character here.
I could just break in with one point there, which is that I think it's good to point out that, yes, he finds clients because they have the same values as he does, and so to that extent, it's his integrity that's contributing to his success. But there's still, I think, a question someone can ask about the end of the book, which is, well, yeah, but in spite of those clients, they're about to put him in jail, and he's even recognizing that that's a serious possibility. He still seems to be somewhat content with that, given the stand that he's taking. But there's one more big thing we'll need to talk about to understand Rand's view that the moral is the practical, and it has to do with understanding why it looks like evil is so practical and so powerful. And that's something we're going to spend more time on later when we get to a different question. But Keith, did you still want to talk about the kind of power that Wynand is seeking?
Why don't we come back to that? Why don't you go ahead with your points and then?
Okay. I mean, as a preliminary to talking about the nature and power of evil, which we had a separate question about, it's important to talk about how morality and practicality come apart, or rather, how you can still see that they're connected to the extent that Wynand defaults on one, he also loses out on the other when it turns out that he doesn't have the kind of power that he thought he was going to have. As soon as Rourke is arrested and he decides he's going to use his power to defend him, and as soon as he tells Dominique, no, I am the one who runs things around here, we immediately start to see that this is not the case. We immediately start to see a litany of attacks coming from people that he himself has employed on his paper or who he's promoted with his paper, people like Clokey, Gus Webb, Sally Brent, attacking him and his stand on Rourke. Alva Scarrett starts using many of the same ideas they're using to discourage Wynand from this campaign. He references Clokey, Lois Cook, Ike the Genius, Jules Fogler, Toohey himself. Again, these are all people that Wynand has either supported or employed or promoted. And as soon as this happens, circulation starts to drop. The workers start to resign. Toohey even is able to slip a column attacking Rourke into Wynand's paper. And that's because he's the one who's been instrumental in getting various editors hired. Advertisers dry up. They're led by that circle of liberal businessmen led by Homer Slotron, who was in Toohey's circle. The board threatens to close the paper. They're led by Mitchell Layton, another one of the people from Toohey's circle. And of course, we know in the face of all of this opposition from people he himself has previously supported or promoted, and that's important, he gives in. The proximate reason is that he fears the loss of the banner, something that he's worked his whole life to create. But after he makes the decision, after he's walking through the streets of the city, after he's found his way inexplicably back into Hell's Kitchen, he starts thinking about how he never really got out of Hell's Kitchen, how the people he grew up with, the people he was afraid of, are his masters. At one point, in his thinking, he says to Rourke, I wrote that column, the one in which he becomes a turncoat and attacks Rourke. I wrote that column the night sitting here in Hell's Kitchen that I decided I was going to try to control the world through a newspaper. And eventually at the end, you see him taking orders from Alva Scarrett, saying, anything you wish, Alva. He realized that he had signed a kind of blank check a long time ago, that the people he sought power over are now cashing in that check. This is where we get the line that his power is like a leash, except that it's a rope with a noose on both ends. We talked last week about how I think that the reason why Wynand is afraid of integrity is because he thinks is because of a kind of fear, a fear of the disapproval of the people who've been his masters. And to the extent that he retains this fear, even until the end, he's not able to eradicate it in spite of Rourke's urging him to not be afraid. That's why he gives in. That's why he doesn't have power. If he had been able to preserve his integrity, if he had been able to preserve his values in the face of what other people might say or how other people might laugh at him, he might have been able to retain some control of things.
You know, I want to slightly disagree with you there, because I listened to your discussions the last 2 weeks. You and Paul talked about it, and generally I agree with everything you said, except that I don't think that Wynand's any part of his motivation is fear of other people's reaction to him. I think that what we get from the story of his childhood is Wynand drawing the conclusion that the only choice that's possible in life is to rule or to be ruled. He doesn't fear, I don't think it's that he fears other people. He's all his life, he's been in a position of being subject to their power. And I don't, I mean, he's portrayed as somebody who's fearless in a lot of ways. He'll stand behind a wall at 12 years old, you know, holding a knife in his hand, waiting to be killed, and he'll just plunge in fearlessly and do it. I don't think he's not portrayed as somebody, we don't see a series of experiences where he's humiliated and people are laughing at him. That's not what characterizes his childhood. What characterizes his childhood is a series of experiences where he has a creative idea, he has some, new innovation that he wants to put forward, and he's told, you don't run things, right? Or he's subject to force in some way. He's beaten down, or literally beaten up and crawling, for his life. So I think it's that he, early on, he drew the conclusion that his only choice in life is rule or be ruled. And he's not somebody, the kind of character that he have is not somebody who's going to submit to being ruled. And so he chose to rule. And that's, so.
Well, this is why I classified him as one of the tricky cases where it's not clear if he's a second-hander or not, and people disagree. I mean, to what you said, I would say it's true that he chose his path because he thought that the choice was rule or be ruled. But the question is then, well, why does he think that? And I think there's a reason why Rourke regards those who go after power as the worst kind of second-hander. You'd have to think that somebody going after power what was still importantly beholden to the values of other people.
Yeah.
And I think it's through fear of disapproval that makes Wynand a kind of second-hand. Now, he wasn't born to be that way, and he fights back against it, but I think he retreats into it at the end. But you wanted to say more about something about the nature of the power Wynand seeking.
The thing is, it's the fear of disapproval part that I don't think is right. It's so. Think about the circumstances in which he grows up. And this is actually something, this is a point that I put in our notes here that I wanted to talk about. So in her later philosophical writings, Ayn Rand makes an important observation. And just to say anything about later philosophical writing. So Ayn Rand wrote The Fountainhead. It was published in 1943. And then she wrote her magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged. She spent 13 years writing it. It was published in 1957. And then after that, she turned to more to cultural commentary into philosophical writings. And she gave talks and wrote, published a newsletter. And most of her philosophical writings are collections of essays that she wrote for these publications or talks that she gave. And in one of her essays, which is a talk that she gave, she makes an important observation about the concept of power. So one of the things we're talking about today is Toohey is portrayed as somebody who's going after power in a certain kind of way, and Wynand is somebody who goes after power in a different kind of way. And in what way? What's different about their pursuit of power? Well, let's just pause and talk a little bit about the concept of power itself, because this is another one of these concepts that's used in our culture that Rand views, and I agree with her, that it's used as a kind of package deal. It puts together elements that are actually fundamentally different. So Rand makes a distinction between what she calls economic power versus political power. Political power is the power of physical force. It's the power of coercion, and it's the power that's wielded by the government. The government has the legal monopoly on the use of physical force. And then her view is that a proper government only uses it in the service of protecting individual rights. So it's only going to be used to retaliate against people who initiate force, right? Whereas economic power does not involve coercion or force. Economic power is the power of production and trade. It's the power of producing goods, offering them on the market, and trading with people through voluntary exchange. So economic power, so somebody like, just to make a real world example, somebody like Jeff Bezos acquires enormous economic power by creating a value that all of us benefit from. 2-day shipping on Amazon, you can get anything in the world in 2 days. That's an enormous value. And we eagerly choose to give him our money because we get such an incredible value from him. That's economic. Jeff Bezos doesn't force anybody to buy from Amazon. But when people talk about power, they blur these concepts together, and you see people talking about a Jeff Bezos or, you know, other billionaires, as though the power that they have is physical coercion, is physical force, the kind of power that government has. And, you know, so that's a major error and it's a major confusion. Now, if you look at the circumstances in which Wynand grows up, he's living in a world where these things are blended all the time, where you know, he's literally growing up in with as a gang of thugs, you know, in a circumstance where physical force is all around him, and um, in his pursuit of power, um, these different types of power are both operative. And think about that in contrast to Howard Rourke. So when what is the when if you ask the question in this term, what kind of power does Rourke seek? He doesn't seek power to dominate or rule or coerce other people. All he wants is the power to produce and trade. He doesn't try to force anybody or bend anybody to his will, right? For Wynand, though, he has concluded that the only possibility that's open to him is to rule or be ruled, to be bent to the will of other people or to bend other people to his will. And notice how he, in his whole career, he's equally willing to use the actual power of physical force and coercion as he is to using economic means. You know, we see this, one of the descriptions of when we get his life story, when he starts to open a paper in Philadelphia, the first time he moves out of New York, right? Nobody could teach him anything about hiring thugs to beat up newspaper delivery boys or beat up the newsstand operators in order to fight his competitors. So he's fighting them in economic means and he's fighting them physically. You look like you want to jump in with something, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are relevant considerations. I'm still not convinced that that it isn't a basic fear of being laughed at that not convinced that's not what motivates him, because I don't think it makes sense of his key decision regarding Pat Mulligan. And that's where his real turning point is. And if you look at the psychology going through his mind when he makes that decision.
Well, but it's the issue of being a sucker. I don't think it's an issue of being laughed at. I think it's an issue of being subject to other men's power. It's not an issue of humiliation or shame or being laughed at. It's an issue of being dominated. I think there's a difference there. And we
have an hour left, so we'll have to agree to disagree on this one. But this is the kind of thing that happens when you try to analyze really rich, intricate literature. And part of the problem is that these people aren't real. Yeah. So they don't actually have a motivation. There's no fact of the matter. There's just what the author has given us as evidence to try to understand it.
So in pursuing power, I mean, unlike Rourke, again, Rourke fundamentally understands what's in his control and what's not in his control. And at a fundamental level, he understands that other people's choices are not in his control. So when he's looking for his kind of client, he's not trying to force anybody to accept his designs. He's putting his work out there and he's waiting for his kinds of clients to come to him, the kind of people who see and understand what he has to offer and choose him. And his success requires that there be other people out there who have the capacity to recognize that and come to him. Wynand doesn't really see that as a possibility, and he sees he sets his goal as being to achieve power by dominating people and bending them to his will. Now, the way he goes about doing that is by pandering to people, by catering to the basest motives and basest values in order to achieve a mass following. And that's how he builds up his paper into this enormous newspaper empire.
Well, as I mentioned before, we need to understand the full picture of why, for Rand, there is a connection between the moral and the practical. We need to understand something about the leading counterexample to this idea, which is, well, what about all the evil in the world, which seems to be always throwing a wrench in the works for moral people, as it does for Rourke, when it, there's a very good chance he's going to be locked away. And we asked a question about this. We asked, how does the end of the Fountainhead portray the nature and the power of evil, especially in the person of Toohey? And I think there's things we can say about Wynand here as well. And this is something that I always knew was beneath the surface of the Fountainhead. I know that it becomes a much more explicit issue later in Atlas Shrugged. But on this latest rereading, I was seeing so much more in connection with this than I had appreciated before. And I think there's some really fascinating stuff here. If what evil is, according to Rourke, is the selfless, which for him means the mindless, having no convictions or values or independent pursuits of one's own, why would the evil then have any power? It's a paradox at the very beginning, at least. And it's one that Rourke himself is confused by when he doesn't understand why it is that when he goes up against these boards of directors, he can't fight against them, but he can't fight against them because there's nobody there, because they're empty. None of them have an ego. There's nothing for him to fight. At one point, he compares them to a blind mass running amok to crush you without sense or purpose. And he refers back to that drooling beast that Stephen Mallory had talked about. Stephen Mallory couldn't define the monster, but he knew that's the drooling beast, the second-hander. But it's a drooling beast that runs amok without sense or purpose. This is all then illustrated in intimate detail when we get to what happens with Cortlandt Holmes. Keating, of course, tries to fight for Rourke's design, but we then get a recounting of the story of what happens. No one could tell how it had happened. That is, how it had happened that his design becomes compromised. There had been no deliberate intention behind it. It had just happened. That's page 609. So that's the blind mass running amok that Rourke had talked about. And then we get to see how Toohey starts encouraging Keating to let other people work with him. And Toohey said he had no purpose in doing it. And we're told Toohey had told the truth. He had no other purpose in mind. The entanglement of responsibility was such that no one could quite be certain of anyone's authority. The pattern that you see at this point is somebody makes some new demand for the sake of some needy interest group, and then someone reacts to that demand by modifying the original plan. They want to express their individuality too. And Keating sees this happening. He wants to kill people. He says he felt a desire to kill, but there was no one to kill. Had he been granted the privilege, he could not have chosen a victim. Nobody was responsible. There was no purpose and no cause. It had just happened. And when Keating then recounts this story to Rourke, telling him it wasn't, nobody really meant for this to happen, they didn't do it on purpose, Rourke responds and says, that's what makes it worse. So on the one hand, you have the idea that this is a product of evil, lack of self, but it still has this destructive effect, even though it's without a purpose. And the question is, how could that be? If evil's so selfless and mindless, why does it still have the power to cause problems? And we get important clues to answer this question, again, in this final section of readings. We know that Toohey's involved in the destruction of Cortlandt in various ways, and it's worth thinking about how Toohey comes to have the influence that he does. We see throughout the book that he sits back and observes the power of the ideas that he's spread, that have animated people to unanimously oppose Rourke, ideas that have come through his councils of artists and businessmen and architects. And so one point is, we know it's something about the way ideas are transmitted. And he tells as much to Wynand when he's sort of mocking the fact you thought you had all the power, but you've left the intellectuals, the whole realm of ideas. It's not money that's the real source of power over men. That's page 644. But then there's the question of, well, why is it that Toohey's ideas are so powerful? Why do they spread so easily? And we get some real insight into this when he's having his conversation with Keating, when he tells Keating that the ideas that he's spread are ones that help people lie to themselves. They help numb their own awareness of their own deficiencies and help them rationalize that by being able to target and hate other people who don't have these deficiencies, people with abilities, people like Rourke. And he knows people have always come to him for his ideas, which help them lie to themselves. You see that on page 632. And then the question is, how do these ideas help people lie to themselves? And again, in that speech to Keating, you get a whole list of things that Toohey says he does in order to try to have power over people. And it's a list that's often quoted, things you should and shouldn't do. This latest reading, for the first time, I really started to see the patterns in the kinds of things he's recommending. And they're all prefaced by the idea you want to try to use a man's soul against itself. You want to engage in internal corruption. You want to use and to spread ideas that smuggle vice in under the disguise of virtue. So you preach self-destruction, but then you portray it as an ideal so that it appeals to people's sense of what's noble. You destroy greatness, but you don't deny greatness. You say mediocrities are great, and then that empties greatness of all its meaning. You tell people that it's evil to be happy, but you don't just say, now you'll be sad. You say, well, you'll achieve a greater kind of happiness. And you don't deny reason. You say reason is limited by something that's even higher and better than reason. So you see, first of all, in the kind of ideas that Toohey spreads, that they work through a kind of parasitism. That's what he means by this internal corruption. They smuggle vice in under the cover of virtue, but that depends on people still caring about virtue. They still care about having some kind of self-respect. Everybody needs self-respect. This relates to that line from Wynand about how the proof of a lack of self-respect is the quest for it. That's what Toohey's ideas allow people to be able to do this. And so then what is it ultimately that gives Toohey power? It's people allowing their self-respect to be hijacked in this way. And you see this come out very explicitly in a confession from Wynand, when after he's caved, after he's sold out to make sure the banner won't close, he's looking at this rubber heel on the face of Howard Roark on the newspaper, and he says, an unknown rubber heel that I released to march. I released them all. I made every one of those who destroyed me. There's a beast on earth damned safely by its own impotence. I broke the dam. There's that beast again, right? Normally it's just running amok. Why does it have any power? Well, because people like Wynand broke the dam. They would have remained helpless. They can produce nothing. I gave them the power. I gave them my strength, my energy, my living power. I created a voice and let them dictate the words. That's page 663. This connects to a more general idea that Ayn Rand has that she works out in much greater detail later in Atlas Shrugged. The idea that left to its own devices, evil is impotent, that it survives and thrives and is empowered only by what she calls the sanction of the victim and the sanction of good people. It's only because good people have power, because there's this connection between the moral and the practical, and because they compromise it, because they violate their integrity, like Wynand does, that they give power to the evil, whether materially by hiring them to work for his paper, or spiritually. And that last is especially important because it's in conceding the power of these ideas which allow vice to be smuggled in under the cover of virtue that the ultimate sanction works. You care about your self-respect enough to try to excuse and rationalize what you're doing. And there's so many examples of this in the book. One, I think, is then the best example. I don't know, Keith, did you want to say any more about this issue of evil before we wrap up with the question about Dominique, because we are running a little over time?
No, why don't we go on then? Yeah.
Okay. So we might have some of the same disagreements about Dominique as we do about Wynand, because one thing to think, so the question that we posted is, what does Dominique learn at the end? How does what she learns explain her eventual reunion with Rourke? And I think something to get clear on in order to answer this question is, how does Dominique fit into the spectrum of independent creators versus second-handers? Is she a creator, or is she in some way dependent? And I'd be interested to hear what the people in the chat think about that. Because certainly there are aspects of her character, there are different aspects of her character which you could interpret under either heading. Of course, it's also important that she changes over the course of the novel, going obviously much more in the direction of being an independent creator. Though she starts out with it, right? So she starts out with this passionate idealism, this independent idealism, and she has amazing abilities. We see how she can write. We see how she can really learn any task that she's given the opportunity to learn, whether it's peeling potatoes in the slums or riding horseback with aristocrats. I see people are in the chat are saying a number of things. Charlotte says, Dominique says she wants independence to not have identity in others and to not depend on others. Okay, that's a certain kind of independence, though it's an independence from the loss of one's own values, not necessarily independence in one's thinking about the world and what values one decides to act on. Gretchen said she should have been a creator, and I never understood why she wasn't, why she didn't. Hero says she looks like she takes too seriously Toohey's principles. It'd be interesting to know which principles. Gretchen says she didn't want a career. Was she held back by fear of the world? Kate says she's not free of being affected by others' influence, which takes the form of her total rejection of them and their values. Stephanie says she's not a second-hander. She's paralyzed by the world she encounters and fights back by withdrawing. So there's a lot about Dominique that seems to fit the profile of an independent creator. But of course, she doesn't end up creating much at the beginning and through much of the book. If anything, she's only working to destroy Rourke. Now, it's because she thinks her ideals don't stand a chance in the world. So she doesn't want to create or protect values in the world for fear of losing them. She fears what society can do to her values.
I mean, is the question really, is she a creator or a dependent, or is she independent or is she dependent?
That's another way of putting it, though. I mean, Rourke packages those together in his speech, independence and creation. And maybe part of the issue is that they need to be unpackaged. But they certainly come apart in Dominique's mind in certain regards. But, I mean, there's a case that you can make that she's independent in certain respects, but not fully independent, because she does care a lot about what the world thinks. She cares about, and this is what Rourke is trying to get her to stop caring about.
Yeah.
Stop caring about what the world thinks and what it's going to try to do to us. Gretchen had posted a question earlier on Facebook about this. She says, I've always been puzzled about Dominique's change. What made her able to face the world without being hurt by it? Was it being with Gale Wynand, seeing his worship of achievement, yet making a fatal mistake and seeking power? And I think it's important to reflect a bit on everything she's seen up until the point where she starts to change at the end. And there's a lot of data that she's taken in. She's seen Rourke rise up in the world in spite of having started from a quarry. She's seen him regain his career and then even become famous in spite of the setback of the Stoddard trial.
And let me just jump in, because I think it's worth mentioning that the point that we brought out earlier, that she's seen him succeed not in spite of his integrity, but because of it, right? Which is important, because she's somebody who upholds these kinds of principles as an absolute. She refuses to compromise on greatness. And it's her view that greatness is doomed to be destroyed in the world that drives her to oppose Rourke, and her fear of seeing greatness destroyed is what motivates a lot of her action through the novel. So the fact that she sees Rourke succeed in spite of because of his integrity is important.
And she sees him win over someone who seemingly had power because he had compromised his integrity, Wynand. And she sees Wynand start to think, well, maybe I should have integrity. Maybe Rourke is getting something from this integrity. And Wynand's own core set of values come out because of being exposed to Rourke. Of course, then Wynand gives it all back and gives in. And we see what comes from that. But we also see that he's destroyed because of it. And she sees that he's destroyed because of it.
And it's because his quest for power is ultimately impotent. And she sees that he thought he had power over the world, but ultimately didn't. And she sees, she says, I've seen the career of Gail Wynand, and now I understand, right?
Yeah. But she has, I think she's made her fundamental shift even before she sees Wynand give in, because it happens as soon as Rourke asks her to participate in the Cortland dynamiting. When he comes to her after it's been adulterated to give some kind of test, she already knows what test she's being given, and we see her reflecting on it, and she says she had not been able to accept the Stoddard trial. She had to run from dread of seeing him hurt the world, but she had agreed to help him in this, had agreed in complete serenity. She was free, and she knew it. I mean, I think the test that Rourke has in mind for her is something like, if she can take the world's response to what it does to Rourke with Cortland, she can take anything.
Right, and the fact that she ultimately returns to Rourke before the outcome of the trial is significant. She's willing to even accept the possibility that he might be thrown in prison as a result of all of this. So
yeah, and Cal had asked that question: what's the purpose of her being placed at Cortland as a bystander? I think there's two purposes. One is this test that I just mentioned, and so if she's like right there to see the whole thing happens, the test is even more real to her. Rourke also mentions another reason, which is that if she's a bystander, then this is on page 620. She's Mrs. Gail Wynand. You're above suspicion, and everyone believes you were at the scene by accident. That way, she won't run to be with Rourke. He doesn't want her to join him right away, because in case he goes to jail, then he thinks that Wynand will need her. So there's a dual purpose there. There's both a kind of psychological test, but then there's also a tactic that he's using to hedge his bets in case he goes to jail. So there's more I could say about Dominique here, and if people want to ask questions, I think it was a good thing to talk about. But I will just add one closing thought about the role of Dominique in this story, which I think is significant. The story of the Fountainhead is the story of Rourke. There's no question about that. Rourke is the hero. He's the protagonist who drives forward all of the major action of the story. And
first and last words of the novel are Howard Rourke.
Absolutely. But I think it's in an underappreciated way, it's secondarily the story of Dominique, because she is the one who develops the most significantly over the course of the entire story. She's the one who develops in the most positive way. There's no single section in the book named after her, even though she's obviously a major character, which is very interesting. But in a way, that's because she's involved in significant ways in every one of these major sections. She's involved and connected and in conflict with each of the other 4 named men in each of those sections. And here, the last point that I think is very relevant is that the author identified with Dominique in certain respects. She famously described Dominique as herself in a bad mood. And so the story of how someone could overcome this bad mood is of real personal importance to the author. And someone asked a question about that quotation, which maybe we'll get to later, and I have more of an answer.
We might as well get to it now. I mean, we're
okay. Yeah, somebody had asked if Ayn Rand had ever elaborated on this, and she did say a little bit more. I don't know if this is more of what you were looking for, but it's something that she, I think, originally said in the interviews that she gave about the story of her life. And if you get this old book, The Who is Ayn Rand, it's written up at one point. And I'll just read a paragraph about this. Psychologically, Dominique Franklin and Ayn Rand are this is based on the interview, are very different. Dominique is motivated by the bitter conviction that values and greatness have no chance among men and are doomed to destruction. Ayn Rand's basic conviction is that evil by its nature is impotent, that only the good, the rational, can ultimately triumph. Yet she arrived at the essence of Dominique's character by means of introspection. Dominique, she's remarked, is myself in a bad mood. Thinking about the contempt that she had felt for the depravity, the passionate rebellion against the rule of mediocrity, the indignation against justice, she asked herself what the consequences would be if that were her permanent inner state and view of life. And thus she projected the psychology of a woman who is stopped and paralyzed by contempt, a woman who withdraws from the world because of the intensity of her idealism, a woman who fights against the man she loves in order to make him renounce his career before he is destroyed. And I checked actually the original transcript of the interview to see if that was accurate. And it was pretty accurate to what she said in those interviews. So I don't know if that's the more that Bonnie was looking for, but that's the more I can give you at least. So I think we should now open it up to general questions. And like I said, we have a list of questions we could get to. But Keith, maybe we should start by looking at some of the questions that are in the chat or that are in the Q&A box that people have posted, and I'll encourage people to continue posting them.
Yeah.
Should we look at first?
Yeah. Well, why don't we take up the question from Cal, because we talked about Rand's reconceptualization of the concept of selfishness, and Cal asks, is she also trying to redefine altruism? And I think there is a way in which he thinks that the way people conventionally understand altruism is that they equate it just with kindness and benevolence and goodwill, and they sort of ignore or downplay the fact that what altruism really means is sacrifice. You know, actually giving up your values for the sake of non-values. And so yeah, I think it's another concept that in her moral philosophy she's trying to clarify and to make and to unpackage these. So when she talks about kindness and benevolence and goodwill and these kinds of positive emotions that people feel towards other people and generosity and so on, she argues that these are emotions that one can feel only on an egoistic framework. It's only if you, I mean, she has Rourke say this to Dominique, to say I love you, one must know first how to say the I. And so to feel benevolence and goodwill towards other people, you have to have a self-sufficient ego. So yes, again, I think she thinks this is another concept that that people hold as a package deal, and then we need to unpackage it and understand what it actually means in what it actually refers to in reality.
One difference, though, is that whereas when she sees a package deal at play in the use of the word selfishness, she tries to save the word selfishness and say, let's have it mean only being someone with a self-sufficient ego who doesn't sacrifice. Throw out the idea of exploitation. She doesn't say about altruism that altruism means kindness and goodwill. Let's be both selfish and altruists. She does define altruism in opposition to selfishness. It's the idea of sacrificing yourself to others. So she does unpackage it, but she uses it then to refer to the opposite, in effect, which is, in fact, what the originators of the term basically meant it. It was a term originated by philosophers in the 19th century, unlike something like generosity or kindness, which are simpler terms that have common sense use. And she thinks selfishness and kindness are compatible with each other.
So there are two questions that I think are related to each other. The question from Brian, who asks, does everyone have a tendency to be like Keating by default? And I think there's a similarity to the question that Ellen asks, where she says, Wynand is destroyed partly as a literary device to prove a point. Would such a person in real life be unredeemable? How about Peter? Toohey is evil by choice and nature and will not change, and he destroys Katie. So, I think the broader question here is, what is the relationship between these characters in the novel and real people? And are there ways in which, like Isabel asks, is it really too late for Keating? Is it possible to lose your sense of self and be unable to get it back? I think all of these questions relate to the broader issue of, what is the relationship between real people and the way the characters are portrayed in the novel? And I think it's, so as we said in previous sessions, part of what Ayn Rand is doing in the novel is she's trying to show what it looks like when people embody certain philosophical principles, and what is the logic of that? How does that play out over the course of their lives? So, in the case of Peter Keating, she's saying, what does somebody who is sort of perfectly second-handed look like? And what does that, what does the arc of his life look like if somebody acts on the principle of second-handedness in this way, as a principle, in effect, as the guiding principle of his whole life, what does that do and what effect does that have? So, and the result is, the arc that Keating goes through and the fact that he's ultimately irredeemable, right? Now, there's a few questions at play here. Does everyone have a tendency to be like Keating? Well, I think, I don't think everybody necessarily has a tendency to be second-handed, but we all face the kinds of choices that the characters are facing about thinking independently or being dependent on other people. I mean, we do face these kinds of choices, and we have to learn, how to be fully independent and how to, we have to learn what are the right principles to live by. And so, I don't think anyone has sort of an innate tendency to be that way, but to be an independent person is, as I said earlier, it is an achievement, and it is something that you have to work towards. I'm kind of blurring all these questions together a little bit, but.
And I also think this is not just a question about how fictional characters relate to real life characters, because there's a real issue about real life people as well. And it's about how does the psychology of character work? And there's two things to say about this. And one comes from Brian's question, does everybody have a tendency to be like Keating by default? Well, I mean, as I think we've stressed throughout discussion of this book, so the author definitely thinks that people have free will. They have the power to direct the choices they make in life and to create their own soul with that power. And there's a lot we could discuss about why she thinks that and what she means by it. But at the same time, she also thinks that the choice is not a perfectly it's not between a perfectly symmetrical pair of options. There's the choice to turn your mind on, to exert effort, to try to form your own values, pursue things in the world, or there's to default on that and to drift through life, to even try to evade the necessity of effort. And I say that's a asymmetric set of choices because one choice involves working really hard and the other one means letting things go. And she thinks you always have that choice. But if you let things go, if you default, if you become a second-hander, basically, then there are mechanisms that at work in your psychology that operate by default, and this is something that she talks a lot about in her later writings on philosophy, in her essay "Philosophy Who Needs It." She says, for instance, nobody has a choice about their need of philosophy. What they do have a choice about is whether they're going to form their philosophy consciously, consistently, through logical rigor, or whether they're going to let their philosophy be programmed by chance associations and ideas they absorb from the culture. And so if you don't turn your mind on, then it's sort of like you're letting the program of your brain be programmed by external forces. And so people start to operate on certain kinds of default mechanisms. She characterizes this as the anti-conceptual mentality. At one point, she says that's our missing link with our evolutionary ancestors. Of course, it's a link we don't have to allow to express itself. We can turn our mind on and take active control. And then she has a whole other view about what happens to your psychology depending upon which of these choices you make. If you allow yourself to operate by default, absorbing things from other people, you'll end up with a very different psychology than if you turn your mind on and take control of the reins. You'll form what she calls a very different sense of life, which is an implicit view of the world. You'll form very different degrees of self-esteem. And the sum total of that is your character. And what a character is, she calls it a soul also, is the set of implicit values and automatized feelings that come from those. And so somebody like Keating, who's spent his whole life evading and drifting and never taking control, he's able at one point in the story to kind of rally and try to take control, but because he spent his whole life being programmed by others and not wanting to exert the effort of facing the facts about himself, that suddenly making that effort really hurts. And for him to become independent consistently would hurt a hell of a lot. So, I mean, Rand's view is that he could do it. He has the free will choice to do it, but it would hurt so damn much that it might kill him. And there are very few people who have just the innate ability to tolerate pain that they can come back from having let themselves be programmed like that over the course of a lifetime. And I think that's why it's too late in a sense for Keating, and probably it's why, I mean, Wynand had a much better chance of being able to come back to it because he wasn't born to be a second-hander, because he was born with some kind of great capacity. But even he has spent so much of his life becoming beholden to others that it's still too painful for him to tear himself away from it at the end, even though he tries pretty hard.
But there's also the question of what is it too late for? Rourke says that about Keating's attempt to take up painting again. And so it's the amount of effort and work and lifetime of practice and skill that's required to be a great artist. I mean, he can sit at his easel and paint little sketches of the countryside. He can do that, but he's asking Rourke, in effect, here's my work that I did out in the country. Is it possible? Do you see the potentiality for me to be a great artist? And that's what's too late. It's for all the reasons you just gave, Ben, that what's too hard is the amount of effort required to develop the skills and the artistic talent at a kind of at the level of high art and great art.
So we've talked about how some of these characters have changed over the course of the novel. We talked about how Dominique improved. We talked about how both Wynand and Keating tried to improve but couldn't succeed. There was a question that was submitted earlier by a couple of different questions that people submitted earlier that I think relate now to Rourke and changes he goes through. And I thought those would be good to address in connection with this earlier issue. So Brian asked a question earlier asking, some people say that Rourke in the later part of the novel is consistent with Rand's philosophy, but in the first part of the novel, he isn't. Do you think there's anything wrong with acting like Rourke does in the first part of the novel? And I think the answer to that question is that there isn't really any change in principle in Rourke's attitude or behavior over the course of the novel. And that's actually pretty important to what it means for him to be Rourke. If you remember that scene where Stephen Mallory is saying people don't really understand that Rourke is the real embodiment of immortality, that he never really changes in a fundamental way. They change every day, they sell out, they give in, but he doesn't. So that's, in the eyes of the author, at least, I think it's the case that Rourke is not changing in a fundamental way. But that doesn't mean that Rourke doesn't change. I think there are two most notable and related ways in which he changes. I mean, he acquires more knowledge and understanding of the world around him. And the more that he acquires, he makes different choices in application of this new knowledge. One is his search for the principle behind the Dean. He doesn't understand what motivates people to act the way they do. He doesn't understand at the beginning of the novel that they are truly selfless in the respect that they lack values and convictions of their own. And once he discovers that, once he realizes that, that has effects on his action. The most notable way that it affects his action, and he doesn't really fully formulate it until fairly late in the novel, but the biggest way that it affects his action is his recognition then that he's been making a mistake in helping people like this, that he's been empowering them. He's been giving them power over him. He's been making a mistake helping Keating to do all of his designs. And that's when he realizes the only way that he can correct this mistake is through a very dramatic gesture. And that's, of course, the dynamiting of Cortland. So that's a big change in direction and kind of change in tactics for Rourke based on a new discovery that he makes. It's not a change in principle. It's not a change in overall strategy. He's still clearly, consistently independent and a man of integrity throughout. It's just that he realizes with new knowledge that he has to apply his principles in different ways than he's been doing. Did you want to add anything to that, Keith?
No, that's good.
Okay. What else do we have on tap? And there's a lot. We've got stuff coming in from several different sources now.
I made the point about economic power versus political power, and there was a question in the chat from Sally that I wanted to just take up. What about money's power to influence politics? Which I think is a good question when you make the distinction between economic power and political power. So the whole phenomenon of cronyism and the influence of money on politics, what to say about that in this context? Well, the thing there is that the problem is that we have a government that has the power to use tax dollars to uh, um, support special interests and to support, to dole out money to various lobby groups and so on. So the whole phenomenon of cronyism and the whole problem with money in politics comes because of government not being restricted to its proper functions. So you have situations where companies can lobby the government for special favors or and can use the power of government in certain ways against their competitors. And competing to acquire governmental power becomes a form of business competition, which it shouldn't properly be. So so what's happening in a situation like that is that people are trying to wield government power in ways that it shouldn't be wielded, and that's where you get these problems. So if we had a government that was constituted properly, then there wouldn't be the possibility of that kind of corruption happening.
But I agree with that. I would add to it that I think that the scene in the book that I probably prompted this person to ask the question, the one about the power of money. Well, that's a scene where Toohey is making the point that this power, it doesn't have as much power as you thought. And so I agree with you, Keith, that like if you're concerned about the role of money corrupting politics, then there's a political solution to it in the one that you mentioned. But it's worth reflecting on how much difference does it make that there are all kinds of business interests that lobby for certain kinds of government policies when these business interests are accepting all kinds of ideas that end up undercutting them in the long run, and for just the kind of reason that Ellsworth Toohey says in the book, that they don't really have power because they give money to their betters, not when they accept the ideas that they're being given not only by these government officials but by other cultural authorities. And we could go into details about that, but I mean, I think you see plenty of this in the Fountainhead already. So, I mean, Ayn Rand had the view generally that this is why what really guides the course of history is not economic interests like the Marxists say, but philosophical ideas. And you can have all the money in the world and like Wynand, you won't control things if you're beholden to other people's ideas. And there's more we could say about that, but I don't think I gave the best portrait of that idea, but there's a lot to say about it. What else do we have?
Some of these look like questions that aren't really questions.
So Cal asked a question, does Rand believe in a predetermination of selfishness? Like some people are born to be selfish, some are born to be selfless. So I've touched on that a little bit already, but there's more to say. It's true that she has Rourke say of Wynand, you were not born to be a second-hander. Now, you might read that as implying that he was born to be independent. But of course, he doesn't say that. And we do get in the story the idea that Wynand seems to face a choice. And I've stressed that the author thinks he has a choice. She believes in free will and she rejects determinism. Now, I should mention that some of the language of what people are born to do occasionally probably works its way into the story because Rand herself was in an earlier period of her life influenced by the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche. And this book bears the marks of that influence in a number of different ways. It was originally going to have passages from Nietzsche at the beginning of each of the major 4 sections. She ended up excising those. She still mentions in the introduction to the 25th anniversary of the book that she mentions one of the quotations that she was going to use, the one about the noble soul having reverence for itself. But she liked Nietzsche in her youth. After she had formulated many of her own ideas, I should mention, but she came to see that there were major differences between their approaches. And one of them was precisely on this issue of determinism versus free will. Nietzsche was a determinist, or at least he rejected free will. He thought that people were born with a certain amount of will to power in themselves, and which would then destine them or not to dominate others or to submit to others. And that's one of the major things about Nietzsche that Rand ended up disagreeing with. She was profoundly opposed to determinism. She thought we really do face a choice. I talked about how the 2 paths are not symmetrical, but it's still 2 paths. You can choose to activate your mind, form your own values, form a real self for yourself, or not. And I should also mention that one of the related points is that she rejected Nietzsche about Nietzsche's view of the will to power is not just that it's a predetermined will, but it's a will to dominate. And in certain ways, you see her critique of Nietzsche coming out in her portrayal of Wynand. Wynand is someone who thinks like a Nietzschean, who thinks that life is about dominating other people. And it's probably, I think, probably symbolic that we see him reading a volume of Herbert Spencer early on in the story. Spencer is someone who had a kind of proto-Nietzschean idea of his own, that we are biologically determined to be either to have abilities or to be poor. That's why he's associated with the idea of social Darwinism. She rejects social Darwinism because it's a kind of biological determinism. And you see that especially with the way that she treats Wynand. So there's even more we could say about that, Cal, but I think we'll have to.
Yeah, we have. So Dawn has asked the same question in a few different ways, a few different times. I think he's very eager to get this discussed. So, and I think the question amounts to the not including Dominique as one of the section heads of the book. Why would it that there's a comment here, an implicit question of Dominique's role in the story. So if the purpose of the book is to set Rourke off in contrast to Keating, Wynand, and Toohey, and there's a way in which Dominique's role is to be a person who's reacting to all the different characters, and the arc that she goes through is in ultimately coming to see that Rourke can succeed and that greatness isn't doomed to destruction, and to recognize what's evil about all the other characters in different ways. So I think the comment that Dawn is making in these different points is essentially right, that it doesn't that her role in the story is different from the 4 kind of principal male characters. And I mean, I think the fact that she's the love interest in the story is also relevant to that. There's a way in which Ayn Rand once described her as sort of the perfect priestess, and ultimately, what she comes to worship is greatness in the form of Howard Rourke.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a way in which she's a spectator. She's not really making decisions that drive forward the plot in the way, especially that Rourke does, even though she's a positive character. And in that respect, she's very different from Kira in We the Living and Dagny in Atlas Shrugged. So Sally asks, and this relates to our earlier conversation about Wynand's motives, Keith, so we may have differences here, but Sally asks, do you think there's a main fundamental reason that causes people to seek power? She's thinking of examples like Stalin, Hitler, Toohey, bullies in school, trying to think of something universal. And I will just say that this is something that Ayn Rand has a lot more to say about in other works. So she has a lot to say about it in Atlas Shrugged. She has a lot to say about it, especially in the second half of Galt's speech, which is the underappreciated half, where she goes into the psychology of evil. And I can't summarize a lot of it very quickly here, but another place that you can look is there's a number of essays that she wrote where this comes up. One is The Age of Envy, and the other is Altruism as Appeasement, but mostly The Age of Envy. And I mean, one of the things that she tries to stress in a number of these sources is that people who seek power are really seeking a way of deluding themselves. That if you can convince other people to fake for you, it helps you fake for yourself. At the root of evil, fundamentally for Ayn Rand, is the idea that is the choice not to look at the world. It's the choice to try to fake reality. And when you don't engage your thinking, when you don't use the tool that you need to survive in a characteristic way, you're telling yourself over time that you are not really able to survive, that you are not able and worthy of living. So you're undercutting your self-esteem. But she also thinks everybody needs self-esteem. She thinks that nobody can survive long thinking that they're a terrible person. Nobody can survive long thinking that they're unable to live or unworthy of living. And so people who characteristically don't bother trying, if they're going to stick around at all, they still have to think of themselves as being good. And so they come up with all kinds of ways of faking their own efficacy and their own worth in their own minds, all kinds of ways of faking their own self-esteem. And one of the biggest ways that she stresses that they do this is by externalizing it. By, if you can force someone else to fake for you, that must make your fake really real. And the way that, and seeking power over another person is a paramount way of doing this. This is most carefully and intimately portrayed in the characterization of James Taggart in Atlas Shrugged. We get a lot of insight into his psychology that we don't get even in someone like Toohey. I mean, I think in certain ways, as you mentioned before, Keith, Toohey's psychology, it's hard to believe it's realistic, in that he does consciously admit how bad he is in ways you don't think anybody could actually do. And so I think it's telling that when you get to somebody like Taggart in Atlas Shrugged, that the author is now much more sensitive, I think, to the fact that people can't do that they can't admit these kind of things to themselves. And so in Taggart, you see dozens of techniques for rationalizing and hiding from himself the fact of how horrible he is. And one of them is his desire to crush other people. So he can't stand the fact that he's never cultivated his own abilities. And so when he sees other people who have cultivated their abilities, like Dagny or Francisco or Reardon, he hates them because they remind him of what he didn't do. And when he can't when he can no longer evade them, when he can no longer get them out of his mind, he's got a choice. He can either use power against, and this is true of a number of other characters as well, but he can either use power against them to try to get them to submit to him, so that it's a way of showing, no, he's really the top dog. He's really the alpha dog. Or he can destroy them. And the ultimate expression of power over others is destroying someone. And if you really can't stand the fact of a person's being better than you, then the ultimate way to do that is to exercise your power and destroy them. And that's the ultimate form of evasion, is killing somebody. And we see what happens when Taggart ends up wanting to do that to people. We also see this a lot in the characterization of Robert Stadler in Atlas Shrugged. So
yeah,
a lot more to say there.
There's a lot more to say, but I think it's relevant that I think her understanding of the phenomenon of free will, her philosophical understanding of it, went through some development between writing The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and that is part of the reason why her portrayal of the psychology of evil is in some ways more realistic in Atlas Shrugged. I think Leonard Peikoff once said that she told him that she took a little bit of poetic license with the character of Toohey, and that somebody couldn't necessarily be that self-consciously evil.
And the major development in her view of free will, I mean, if you look at Rourke's speech, what we asked a question about this, the way he puts it is the basic choice is between dependence and independence, to be a creator or to be a looter, or to be a creator or to be a parasite, rather. And the view that she develops in Atlas is much more fundamental than that. It's the choice to think or not. It's the choice to face reality or not, which is what I was alluding to. And it's consistent with the creator versus second-hander choice, but she's getting to the deeper psychological issue later in Atlas.
Yeah, I just want to take up one quick question in the chat, because we can just give it a reference here. Salamatu is asking, what is Ayn Rand's view on racism? She has an article on racism in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. Her view essentially is that it's a form of collectivism, which she rejects. She calls it the lowest, most primitive form of collectivism. And the idea that you ascribe to somebody characteristics that aren't subject to their choice, that are just based on physiological characteristics. She says she rejects that and thinks that's wrong.
Yeah, so it's racism for her is an example of collectivism, pretty obviously, because it celebrates a group, a race, over individuals. For the reason you just mentioned, it's a form of determinism, because it has the view that people's character is determined by their biology. So that's further to the point that she rejects determinism and affirms free will. But I also say one other thing that's interesting about racism is that it is a particularly crude form of determinism and collectivism, because the group that you end up associating with and thinking determines your identity is a group that's based just on your visible perceptual skin color and things like this. And so another thing that racism is an example of is this anti-conceptual mentality that I mentioned before. It's an example of what it looks like to default on the process of thinking. So you don't bother forming any values of your own. You don't bother trying to grasp the world on your own, make your own way in the world. So instead, you kind of turn your mind off and you go into one of those default mechanisms like, well, who has skin color that looks more like mine? That's much easier to do. And I think it's not an accident that basically every primitive tribe in the world, regardless of race, starts out racist. I mean, racism is the default operating mechanism for humankind. And it's only when we develop our conceptual faculties and learn to see the similarities that we all have with each other underneath the surface level differences that we become civilized and we become individuals.
Have time to quick, are we essentially out of time? Aditya asked a couple times about Rourke versus Cameron. Maybe we should make that the last question, since we're...
Okay, so he asked, why is Rourke
successful but Cameron not?
Cameron is not, even though Cameron has the same philosophical ideas.
I mean, I think that the Cameron is portrayed as somebody who does succeed. You know, he puts up a number of important buildings, but then the way it's portrayed in the story is that the sort of tide of the culture turns. And he's also somebody who what he doesn't have, which Rourke does have, is that basic recognition of what is and isn't subject to his control. Cameron still has a kind of tension and conflict with his clients. He's not in the position that Rourke is in, where he can just, or he doesn't have the same perspective or attitude that Rourke has, which is that the people who want him will come to him, and he'll hold out for those people. Cameron is described as sort of being insulting and belligerent and driving clients away with his personality. Even though their architectural principles are the same, I think it's partly just, it's an issue of the way the culture is portrayed evolving at the different times in the story, and aspects of Cameron's personality. I mean, maybe you have something more insightful than that.
Well, I would say there's also an important similarity between Cameron and Stephen Mallory and Dominique in their views of evil. So Cameron is the one who's always saying, "Look out for the banner. It's the foulest paper on earth. If there's one person I could get rid of, it would be Gail Wynand, right?" Stephen Mallory is the one who worries about evil in the form of the drooling beast,
and tries to shoot Ellsworth Toohey.
So both of them think evil is powerful, and Dominique does too for a while, and it's part of the reason why she fears the world. So they're, to one degree or another, hampered because of their fear. Mallory needs Rourke's inspiration to kind of get out of his slump, and obviously so does Dominique. And it's an interesting question. Well, what if Cameron had someone like Rourke to inspire him earlier on, or had been able to inspire himself in the same way to figure out that, because Cameron too hadn't figured out the principle behind the Dean. He hadn't figured out, the source of all this is that people don't have a self. And so if I don't give them anything, if I don't help them, then they won't have any power over me. And then I won't have to fear them in the way that he and Mallory and Dominique do.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're a little bit over time here.
And we got lots of other questions that unfortunately we couldn't answer. I'll say this. If there's one that's really that you're really burning up about, find my email address and send me a question. I know some people who are listening have already been doing that. I've been corresponding with some people, bbayer@aynrand.org, but that's easy to look up. But sorry that we couldn't get to more of your questions in the course of the actual discussion. There's obviously so much to talk about here. Having just 7 sessions for a book like The Fountainhead is really not even doing it justice. We did 40 sessions for Atlas Shrugged, and that didn't do it justice. I don't think we're going to do a Fountainhead project anytime soon. This will have to suffice for the time being, but I've had a lot of fun doing it, and I know that a lot of you have been keeping with us to the very end. Whenever you do a project like this, it's always an interesting question. How many people who are there for the first session are going to make it all the way to the end? And I think we've had a good number of people stick with us all the way to the end. And I hope you've gotten something out of it. So, and Keith, I want to thank you for joining me, and for Paul Tasky, who's also joined me for a couple of episodes. And I know Paul's watching right now and he's been helping us vet questions. So thank you, Paul. Keith, I should say goodbye to you now so I can close with a few announcements.
Okay, well, I'll say thanks to you for taking the lead on this whole series. I think it's been really fun and hopefully enlightening to people who are doing the essay contest and people who just want to learn more about Ayn Rand's ideas. So I'll say goodbye, everybody, and I'll let you sign off, Ben. Thanks.
Thanks, Keith. So I just want to give people a few pointers and tips for things that they can do to continue to follow us now that the Fountainhead Reading discussion group is over. One place where you can continue to get a weekly serving of ideas coming from Ayn Rand's philosophy in a webinar format like the one that we're doing right now is our weekly webinar series, New Ideal Live. So New Ideal is the online journal of the Ayn Rand Institute. You can learn more about it at newideal.aynrand.org. But if you would like to follow our webinars, we have these Mondays and Wednesdays, sometimes only one of those two, but we won't have one Monday this coming week because it's Memorial Day, but we will be doing one on Wednesday. Those happen 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern, and they're also conducted through Zoom. If you want to be able to interact with us directly, the best way is to go to this meeting ID, 812-506-718. And if you're watching this on Facebook or on YouTube, these New Ideal broadcasts are always through those same channels as well. So you can find them by subscribing to the ARI YouTube channel, by liking the Ayn Rand Institute Facebook page, which you might be watching this through also. Another pointer for how to stay in touch with us, if you liked digging deeper into Ayn Rand's ideas, into grappling with the philosophic concepts that are at work behind the scenes, animating the characters of her fiction, I can't recommend enough applying for the Objectivist Academic Center. Both I and Keith and a number of others are instructors in the Objectivist Academic Center. This is basically a 9-month academic program that runs from the fall to the spring every year. It's a 3-year program. It's kind of like a mini undergraduate education in objectivist philosophy. In the first year, you will study the basics of objectivist philosophy using our textbook, which is Dr. Leonard Peikoff's Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. In the second year, you'll learn more about the history of philosophy and how objectivism fits into the history of philosophy. You'll also take a writing course that's taught by Keith Lockitch. And in the third year, we do a seminar where we learn how to apply objectivist thinking methodology to the analysis of contemporary ideas and problems. And you can learn more about our program offerings by going to this website that I have up above, aynrand.org/students/objectivist-academic-center. We are currently taking applications for new students who will enroll in the fall. There are scholarships available for graded students. I'm, as I mentioned, one of the instructors, and I'm looking forward to looking at those applications. We'll be starting to review them in a couple of months. The deadline, I don't think, is until July. So you've still got some time to look at that. And I know especially that a number of students are thinking about taking a gap year right now. Maybe they won't go to college in the fall. They'll take a year off. What better way is there to spend your time during your gap year than by really grappling with a rational philosophy like Ayn Rand's? I think it would give you all kinds of tools for then returning to college the following fall. One last announcement. I would be incredibly remiss if I did not make this point, and that's that the discussion series that you've seen over the last 7-8 weeks obviously is not free. The Ayn Rand Institute and its activities are funded by private donors. And if you liked what you saw, if you would like to see us do more like it, if you would like to be able to help spread your appreciation for Ayn Rand and her ideas, not only to people reading her fiction, but to people who want to read her nonfiction, who want to read articles that we write for New Ideal, see webinars where we present how Ayn Rand's ideas apply to the world around us, then your donations are more than appreciated. And I not only do I want to ask for donations, but I especially want to thank those of you in our audience who are and have been our donors for many years. And I know there are many longtime donors who have been watching. We couldn't do this without you. And I know both I and Keith and all the other employees at ARI have a great deal of gratitude. And but what makes us especially happy is that there are people out there who who identify with these values enough that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is and to make webcasts like the one that we are now concluding possible. So if you're interested in joining as an ARI member, please check out aynrand.org/donate. And we especially these days encourage people to become monthly contributors. You might have a certain amount of money that you have in mind to give. It can really help us a lot if you become a monthly member contributor. You can do that on different levels. This is something that gives us the ability to plan much more easily in the future, because it determines a more steady flow into the Institute. And we can't do programs like this without that. So that's all I have to say. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and stay tuned for future programs like this. I already mentioned New Ideal. We'll see if we have any other kind of webinar series up our sleeve. Talk to you then. Bye-bye.